Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's symposium. This is the eighth semi-annual symposium of the Wisconsin Association of Scholars, which is an affiliate, a state affiliate of the National Association of Scholars, the mission of which is to uphold the standards of a liberal arts education that fosters intellectual freedom, searches for the truth, and promotes virtuous citizenship. In addition to intellectual freedom, we vigorously support academic freedom, freedom of expression, and free speech. Hopefully, everybody on the call, if we're not familiar with National Association of Scholars, will go to nas.org and find out more about this wonderful organization. So, the person to whom I'm going to turn things over now is the secretary of Wisconsin Association of Scholars and also professor of political science at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, Shale Horowitz. Shale, will you introduce our fabulous panel of speakers?
I will. Thank you, Benjamin. So, we're going to be talking about civics in American education the next 250 years. Just briefly, what are we interested in covering here in this discussion? Civics is an important emerging field at American universities. It seeks to restore educational and scholarly attention to traditional Western values and institutions that were once regarded as cornerstones of university education, but which have been attacked and neglected as universities have tilted farther to the left. Our first two speakers run civics education and scholarship institutions at universities. The third has studied and supported the spread of civics institutions across higher ed. In this discussion, we have a number of goals. What do these civic programs do? How do they fit into the universities where they're located? What are their achievements so far? What are their strengths and weaknesses? And what are the lessons we should draw going forward? Let me briefly give some background on our distinguished speakers. First speaker, Matthew Brogdon, is the director of the Center for Constitutional Studies at Utah Valley University. Previously, Matthew was an associate professor of political science at the University of Texas at San Antonio, where he taught in the fields of American politics, constitutionalism, and political philosophy. His scholarship examines American constitutionalism with special attention to the federal judiciary. He has published on the constitutional origins of judicial federalism and the development of the federal courts, among other topics. His current book project is Constitutional Foundations of the Modern Judiciary, which seeks to recover the institutional logic that animated the framing of Article 3 of the Constitution. Our second speaker is Daniel DeSalvo. He is professor and associate dean of faculty development and curriculum in the School of Civic Life and Leadership at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He previously served as professor and chair of political science in the Colin Powell School at the City College of New York CUNY and is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. His scholarship focuses on American political parties, elections, labor unions, state government, and public policy. He is the author of Engines of Change, Party Factions in American Politics, 1868 to 2010, and Government Against Itself, Public Union Power and Its Consequences. He writes frequently for popular publications, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Atlantic Monthly, National Affairs, City Journal, LA Times, and New York Daily News. Our third speaker, Benjamin Story, is the Ravenel Curry Chair in Civic Thought, Senior Fellow in Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, AEI, co-director of AEI's Center for the Future of the American University. Prior to coming to AEI, Dr. Story served as the Jane Gage Hipp Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Furman University, where he taught for 17 years. He is the co-author of Why We Are Restless on the Modern Quest for Contentment. His writing has appeared in such outlets as the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, National Affairs, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. So thank you, all of you, for coming. And let's just start with each of you speaking about their experience. Matthew, would you like to begin?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I'm delighted to get to speak to a group affiliated with NAS. And it's an admirable thing that tripartite commitment to intellectual freedom, pursuit of truth, cultivation of virtuous citizens. Um, it is a it's perhaps an apt summation of many of the things that civic thought programs are seeking to cultivate and advance. Um, so I think a helpful thing to do would be to say a couple of words about what I think is distinctive about what's going on with the advancement, particularly of publicly created and funded civic thought and leadership programs, as we've sort of attached that label of civic thought, especially as a bit of an umbrella term that cover a lot of particular varieties within the tent. Um, but I want to describe what I think is distinctive about this, and by describing that, maybe point out what the ways in which it's running counter to or running into, I guess you say, swimming upstream of the dominant current in American higher education. And then I'll talk a little bit about how our own Center for Constitutional Studies and the Civic Thought and Leadership Initiative that operates within it came into being and how those things have played out. And then I'll hand the baton off. So first of all, there's a lot of talk of educating for citizenship. The idea of citizen education, or as you know, you can usually tell what approach people take to this by the terms they like to attach to it. Some folks like to emphasize civic engagement. Um, some of us talk about civic knowledge. But the notion of citizenship, if we take it seriously, I think, suggests uh, something particular. I think educating a citizen is educating a citizen for citizenship or the bearing of the responsibilities and rights of citizenship in a particular regime. Um, I think one sort of effort to um, split the baby, so to speak, in terms of civic education has been to talk about educating for democratic citizenship. I think a lot of new programs emerging in elite higher education, I guess what we might call the sort of voluntary programs that some of our colleagues at places like Stanford and Yale, and there are plenty of examples of these around the country. Institutions have tried to create these programs, and I think that they've aimed at this idea of democratic citizenship because it sounds a little less patriotic, a little less particularistic. It preserves some of the cosmopolitanism of higher education as it's developed in the last century or so. And I think that that's probably not quite tenable in the long run. To the extent that we talk about preparing citizens, we're preparing citizens for citizenship in a particular place. And that means anytime we get serious about this, as we have at different institutions, including my own, it means that unavoidably we're talking about what's distinctive about American citizenship. And particularly, I'd put this in Lincolnian terms, that Lincoln said the preservation of our constitutional order, our constitutional inheritance. We use the language of inheritance a lot around here. Uh, the preservation of that inheritance implies a certain attachment to it. And if you want to see a lot of people squirm, you can start talking about the responsibility of an academic unit to cultivate attachment to our constitutional inheritance or attachment to a political tradition. That is freighted with a great deal of sort of substantive commitments uh, for our social scientific colleagues, a lot of normative commitments. Um, but I do think talking seriously about citizenship means that the citizen has to be committed at minimum to preserving and, we usually like to add, improving the inheritance they have. So I think that's sort of number one. And one of the things that runs afoul a lot in higher education is that when we talk about this, we're talking about a substantive commitment to American as opposed to just a generic democratic citizenship. Um, Secondly, I'd like to emphasize that this effort looks a little different at different institutions. So if you survey the institutions that have adopted it, and you're going to hear from Dan shortly about UNC Chapel Hill's experience with this in the School of Civic Life and Leadership, you'll notice there's a broad spectrum of institutions involved in this. Big states, small states, um, and R1 institutions, teaching-focused institutions. UVU is a very large state school, the largest in the state, that's essentially an open enrollment public institution with a very different mission in some respects, at least in terms of its faculty activity. I mean, the things that we do from our from colleagues at a flagship state institution. So I think another question that we wind up answering whenever we attack, sort of pursue these programs is what kind of institutions are we dealing with? And I do think it's important to give due attention, one, to the revitalization of the study of the Western and American political tradition. And that quite often is led in a substantial sense by the faculty who commit themselves principally to research. And that does happen at our research-focused institutions. And you would expect colleagues at state flagships and elite institutions to be leading the way. And I don't want to minimize the importance of that at all, because that has an enormous impact on our disciplines. And our academic disciplines have not given due attention to these things. They've lost focus on them, which is why we're creating all these new institutions. So that's a very important endeavor, but important also is how this works out in practice at institutions where most Americans go to college. Your open enrollment, regional state institutions. I might add, these are the institutions where most of the people who will hold public office in America go to college. So if you were to survey the police commissioners, city councilors, school board members, not to mention your rank and file bureaucrats in the typical state, as well as state legislators, most of them do not go to our state flagship institutions or to elite private institutions. Most of them attend run-of-the-mill public institutions all over the country. So I think we have to give some due attention to what an endeavor like this looks like at an institution like the one that I teach at, and some others. And in that case, I think it's important to talk about the fact that when we talk about a liberal education, which I think civic thought and leadership is reviving a liberal education in many respects, it's not identical with Newman's liberal education. It's not just education for the life of leisure and reflection. In fact, I really love there's a not well known or often noticed essay by Herbert Storing about educating for citizenship. And he talks about the fact that in democratic or republican societies, people are concerned with work and with citizenship. That's the two principal tasks. We don't have lives of leisure. And so citizenship education is neither simply liberal education, nor is it simply vocational education. It's civic education, which partakes of both practice and, um, both ideas and practice, both theory and praxis. So I think that's important to consider is how we implement those things. So a little bit about CCS and what we do here. So I run the Center for Constitutional Studies at UVU, and that institution existed before the state legislature made any kind of intervention, and we were engaged in the activity of resurrecting and reviving the study of our constitutional history and our especially constitution making. We had started a minor in constitutional studies, so we were making some headway here at the institution. We are not an academic department. We're a center that was already housed under the office of the provost in the institution, with the ability to collaborate with academic units around campus. In 2021, the legislature introduced a bill and passed legislation modeled on what had happened at Arizona State with Skettle, which they carved a little bit of the verbiage out of it and settled on the term civic thought and leadership. They started a civic thought and leadership initiative here at UVU. And instead of making it its own academic unit, making it a school or a college, had been done and would subsequently be done in a number of places. They provided a substantive legislative mandate to pursue the study of and promote the study of Western civilization and of the American constitutional tradition, and within the disciplines of political science, history, economics, and philosophy, an interdisciplinary mandate, but housed it here in the center. Um, and so a distinctive, we're not the only institution that functions this way. So far, Florida State's Institute for Governance and Civics has been in a similar situation. You have a substantive mandate at an institution where there's not a separate academic unit doing this. And so that leaves us in the position of partnering with academic units on campus to hire faculty, to create new programs. Um, and that has some benefits and some drawbacks, some very real ones. Um, and so a couple of successes we've had at doing that, we did create a master's degree in constitutional governance, civics, and law that was aimed both at school teachers in the state and has been highly successful and expanded very rapidly, and a smaller research cohort, drawing students in to study the constitutional tradition with the idea of moving them on in academic careers. And that's been highly successful. And we did that, of all things, in partnership with the School of Education. Now, I think this is because the School of Education had no idea what constitutional government, civics, and law is. And they thought, we don't study these things. So, sure, sounds like things teachers need and want. So, thankfully, they had a very practical view of the matter. Said teachers want more training in these areas. You're willing to give it to them and you have the expertise. So, please, by all means. So, we created that master's program. I mentioned we had a minor. We began taking responsibility for the general education course in American institutions at the university, which is a course we call American Heritage, um, and trying to reshape that course and funnel faculty into it who would teach it according to the priorities of promoting understanding of and attachment to our constitutional inheritance and reflection on the Western and American political and intellectual traditions. And we've had success at doing that as well. But in none of those cases do we own those programs the way that a college would. They are our programs, but housed in academic units around campus. That has made us less threatening to the university in some ways. It's also involved a great deal of statesmanship. I would say, if I were to cite my good friend Shiloh Brooks, um, we've then been forced to build by our own arms and virtue, in the Machiavellian sense, to sort of go it, to accomplish what we can. And we've accomplished a great deal. What that is materializing into right now is the creation, without further legislative intervention, the creation of a new school of what will probably be called government and civic life. That's not just CCS and civic thought and leadership programs, actually combine faculty from political science, perhaps from some other units on campus. We have a national security studies program, as well as the substantial faculty we've hired. We've hired about 9 or 10 faculty, depending on how you count them, tenure track faculty who serve our programs and so forth, and are really substantially answering to the center. So that will create, at the university's own motion, an academic unit. It'll be a school that really operates as a sort of mega department within the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and will give us an academic arm, a unit in which our faculty and programs can be housed and consolidated, and therefore have some control. I'll just say this, a metaphor I have used is, if it's between having my faculty that I'm subsidizing and helping to hire spread out around the university or having them concentrated in one place, I'd rather have all the troops in one garrison, rather than spread out all along the wall. So that's where we stand right now. I'd love to, once Dan and Ben have had their shot at this, maybe you all have questions about how this has worked. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Daniel, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you, Shale. I hope everyone can hear me well. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. had some mix-ups with my flights and things today, so I'm actually doing this from the airport. So if I have to get drop off camera later in the conversation, that's the reason. But I'm happy I can be with you. Um, I think what we've been doing at UNC tracks in many ways with the wise and elegant description that Matt gave of what he's doing at UVU. Our remit is really to, um, in some sense, give you could say, a liberal arts education of a sort inside a Research One university, focusing primarily on the Western intellectual and political tradition with a specific focus on American institutions and thoughts. So I think one other piece of our broader intellectual remit, coming out of organic developments from within UNC, but um, also coming in from the legislative mandate creating the School of Civic Life and Leadership, were really to do something to increase the amount of dialogue across difference and be you could say um, a a place where different arguments and students would be exposed to different arguments from the public debate and different views, which wasn't, at least in the legislature's estimate, and in many on campus's estimate, always happening. So our school is a little bit different. I'll give you the broad outlines from what Matt described. Is under the legislative mandate, this is a separate entity. At least initially, it's created and is still housed inside the College of Arts and Sciences. But we have the authority to hire tenure line faculty, and this would be a new tenure home for those faculty. Those we have hired are come from many different disciplines: philosophy, religious studies, political science, political theory, history. And in some ways, we've had an eye to focusing on, you could say, underrepresented parts of some of those fields. So, for example, we recently brought on board a military historian. Military history has been, for example, declining in popularity at many universities, but it still remains very popular with students. So this is seen as a kind of area where we're bringing a certain intellectual diversity that is declining in other fields or disciplines. I could say more about how that's worked out in political science or other fields. So we have a very interdisciplinary faculty, and that creates its challenges. But I think it's really been generative what we've been doing in terms of creating a new and distinctive program to try to give you that liberal arts education, again, inside a Research One university. So we have a lot of programming around the classes themselves to give students a little bit more of that high touch experience that they would get if they were at an Amherst or a Williams, a Bowdoin, a Bates, something like that, but they wouldn't get that much interaction with faculty and speakers, and a little bit of some practical side to the liberal arts. So there's a lot of additional programming around what we do. But then I would say we're trying to compress into something. Right now we have a minor. Skill has only existed we're approaching the end of its fourth semester, and we're hoping to bring a major online within the next year. But at that stage, it's really been, I'd say, a fruitful intellectual enterprise to say, well, how can you design a curriculum that's going to fulfill that broader mandate for something like this Western America-focused liberal arts education over a series of courses that are going to be interdisciplinary and bring together faculty from different fields. And I think that's been a process we've been working on very hard over the last year, and it's been a creative and interesting one. And I think the design and where we fit into, you could say, the broader university undergraduate curriculum is to provide, in some sense, you could say, a short course version of a liberal arts education, which is to say there are many students, for example, at UNC, who want to major in exercise science, but who are interested in the liberal arts, but they don't quite know where to go. They could take one English class here or one history class there, but they're not really getting a kind of stamp of approval for doing any of those extra things and pursuing those interests outside of their probably pre-professional degree in exercise science. So what our aim is to say is, come to Skill, you major in civic leadership, and you'll get that thing, and you'll get a second major, and you'll get something coherent rather than just some random um, liberal arts classes here and there. So I think that's the opening wedge we see into the undergraduate curriculum. Um, I would say, obviously, setting this up has been a challenge, especially at a place like UNC, which is a flagship state university. Um, it's also in Chapel Hill, which is a small university town where it's a kind of a company town, and there's a lot of focus on the university itself. So the level of scrutiny of every move we make is very, very high. And it's to some extent to be expected that anytime you're introducing a new unit into a university, there's going to be some birth pangs and some friction, as some people are supportive of what you're doing, other people are opposed. So there's always going to be that. There's, I think, many lessons I've learned on some details, which perhaps we want to go into in the Q&A about how to exactly think about setting up something like this, where you're going to be granting making a tenure home and hiring faculty, and what you need to do in terms of process and so on, that I think is probably important and would smooth some of these things as new places move in this direction, should they wish to do so. So I think that's, but there's always going to be a certain amount of friction, since there's going to be opposition from different quarters and for different reasons, from political opposition to people just the traditional academic scramble over scarce resources. So I think I'd probably leave it there and turn it over to Ben, but I'm happy to say more on any particular details about Skill. I guess one last thing I would mention, a little bit different from Matthew, is at a Research One university, there's obviously an emphasis on research. And so the faculty that we hire have to have a research profile in addition to what we're going to be asking them to do on the teaching and mentoring front of undergraduate students. So in some sense, the people we're hiring, we're asking a little bit more from them, because they're going to need to have a publication and research profile commensurate with tenure and so on at a Research One university. In addition, we're going to ask them to be more student focused maybe than some faculty have been in the past. So that too presents an interesting challenge of exactly how you strike that balance. But I'll leave it there and turn it over to Ben.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Benjamin?
Oh, great. Thanks. It's great to be in conversation with you all, and here with Dan and Matt, who I've been talking with for a long time. So just give you a quick sense of my background. I came to the American Enterprise Institute after 17 years at Furman University, where I was leading an academic reform program alongside my work as a teacher and a scholar. And at AEI, the distinction between my perspective on these things and the perspective that Dan and Matt have brought to bear is that they, of course, know what's going on in these institutions firsthand from on-the-ground experience. My concern is with looking at these projects as a national set of things that is all moving in a certain direction. So I spent a lot of time in conversation with people like Dan and Matt, and what I see from those conversations is the emergence of a new academic caught a lot of headlines. Sometimes they're maligned by people likening them to the studies programs that emerged in the 1970s. People say they're a kind of politicization of the academy, this time not from the left, but from the right. I don't think the analogy to the 1970s is accurate. I think you should look to a different historical analogy, which is an analogy to the 1870s. The 1870s was also a moment of tremendous academic upheaval. That was the moment of the arrival of the German Research University, and that's when most of our modern departmental structures was born. And so that's when you'll find the origins of the first departments of political science, first departments of sociology, the first departments of many of the humanities as we now know them. So it's worth remembering in these conversations that there are no departments on our campuses that are any older than about 150 years. And over the course of the 150 years that has lapsed since we started organizing academic inquiry into the department, there has been a lot of fluctuation in the lines of those departments and the organization of human inquiry in this way. And a lot of those changes have actually come in response to developments in the outside world. So, for example, if you think about how much universities changed in response to the Second World War, you have seen the outside world making its mark on how we think inside the university many times in the past. I think what you can I think one way to think about the emergence of civic thought is as an academic answer to a political question. That is, politicians in states like Utah, North Carolina, Texas, Florida, Ohio, and so on. Politicians are coming to the university and saying, we need your help. That is, we need something from you that is distinct from what you've been doing that will help us remedy what is broadly perceived as a civic crisis, as a whole in the area of university level civic education. And so in response to that, academics like Dan and Matt and many other fine scholars all over the country have developed these really serious programs in which people are doing not only great teaching, but also really serious research. And that research and teaching has a specific direction that distinguishes it from other things that are going on campus. And so this is what I mean about the movement of the lines by means of which we separate and organize academic inquiry. So what's the new piece on the field that is coming into play with the development of civic thought? I think what these programs do is respond to what Peter Levine, who's a political scientist up at Tufts and actually a leader of a related movement called civic studies, what Peter calls the citizen's question. And the citizen's question is, what should we do? And so if you notice that question has as its emphasis, and this picks up on something Matt was saying a little bit earlier, has as its emphasis the point of doing, the point of action. And so in this, I think what these civic thought programs can be said to be studying that is distinctive from some other things on campus, what they can be said to be doing is developing a distinctive form of intellectual excellence that is actually just not the aim of a lot of other departments on campus. And so if you think about the most closely analogous department to these new schools of civic thought, I think of political science. And as you can tell from the name of political science, it aims to look at the political world scientifically. And I think civic thought aims to look at it a little bit differently. It aims to look at the political world not from the outside, like a scientist does, but from the inside, as an owner, as a participant, as a citizen. In this sense, the excellence, the specific intellectual excellence that I think these programs of civic thought are starting to cultivate is the excellence of prudence. And we've known that prudence is a specific form of intellectual excellence since the time of Aristotle, but it has been strangely neglected in the organization of inquiry in our universities over the course of the last few decades. So I think it's by aiming at that specific telos that these new schools of civic thought are defining or can define the distinctive contribution they're making to the university. As you could tell by looking at the course catalog at a place like UNC, or Utah Valley, a lot of times they offer a very wide range of courses touching on a very wide range of subjects, and that is perfectly appropriate. As Dan said, it's a form of liberal education. And as Matt said, it's a form of liberal education that is focused on the civic. That is, it's not just stepping back, as Matt said, it's not just thinking for its own sake in the manner of John Henry Newman. It's thinking related to action, which is what the kind of thinking that is appropriate to all of us insofar as we are citizens. And so you have a distinctive intellectual telos of these various programs. So this argument for disciplinary innovation that is being developed by these programs, this argument is making a lot of headway in the academic world, and this is something that my wife Jen and I have been pretty involved in and have been able to observe up close. So taking the lead, following the lead rather, from these state-developed programs, such as Matt and Dan have been describing, civic thought is starting to get traction in elite private higher education. And so just earlier this week, I had the last of about 8 meetings over the course of this past year that were part of a civic thought project that is being developed at Johns Hopkins, which Jen and I are participating in directly. As I think Matt mentioned earlier, our friend Brian Garston has launched a civic thought project at Yale. Jenna, my wife, was involved in conversations about civic thought in the Harvard context a little bit earlier this year. Stanford is launching a civic thought and practice minor. I've been involved. Jenna's been involved. I'm not sure if Dan and Matt have been involved, but I think they might have. In the Alliance for Civic in the Academy, which has been developed by Josh Ober out at Stanford, which is meant to bring together a lot of these new programs in civic education from across the country as something like an emerging academic field. And we've been working in partnership with another group of projects that go under the umbrella of civic studies. Civic studies was launched by the great political scientists Eleanor Ostrom and others about 15, 20 years ago. Peter Levine is now the main leader of that movement, and he wants to work hand in hand with all of these projects. So my urging to you all in Wisconsin, insofar as some kind of project like this might be on the horizon for you, is simply to watch what people like Matt and Dan and our friends at the University of Texas and the University of Tennessee and the Ohio State University and a number of colleges across Ohio, watch what they're doing. Take their example seriously. You'll want to do something that is distinctive and appropriate for whatever particular campus a Wisconsin project might take shape on. But it's important for these projects to move together, because it's by moving together that we can develop something like an academic field. And it's academic fields that ultimately take hold and gain permanence on all over the academy. And so, we want civic thought eventually to become something like a history department. That is the kind of thing that no self-respecting university can do without. We've made extraordinary progress in that regard over the course of just the past 5 years since these projects started to spread outside of Arizona, and I'm really excited to see where things go from here. Thanks very much.
Thank you all. That was really great. Let's start with some broad questions that each of you may have some input about. One point which you all have touched on a little bit, but maybe we can much more directly get at this, is what are the strengths and weaknesses either of your individual programs or for you, Benjamin, more broadly, the programs that have been started so far? Where have the greatest strides been made, and where are the biggest gaps? So yeah, please, Matt, you want to start with that?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. I'd note a couple of strengths. One is that we've been able to do some things that a typical academic department, receiving its priorities from academic disciplines. And I would say that's a very important distinction. If you're running a program like this, that its priorities, its aims are based on these civic needs, needs of the institution, needs of students, the ability to ignore what the American Political Science Association, the American Historical Association thinks an academic unit ought to be doing is really a benefit. And that's allowed us, for example, to do a couple of things. One is serving constituencies that the disciplines don't often pay a lot of attention to. So UVU has planted its flag on becoming the university that serves the needs of K-12 civic educators in the state. So we have a huge operation that is statewide that operates in every county and school district in the state, where we work with about 500 Utah social studies teachers a year in person. Um, that is both expensive and time consuming. It involves professional staff that quite often are not involved in an academic unit. And that has allowed us to bring our expertise, which is typically missing ironically, both in the education sphere, doesn't have a lot of expertise running around on American constitutionalism, American history, military history, or intellectual history. There's just not a lot of academic expertise in the education field on that, which is coming into contact with teachers a lot, nor is there really a whole lot of expertise on it in our traditional academic departments. So, because we've been able to assemble that expertise, again, ignoring the sort of signals from the disciplines, we then can really plant our flag and make a claim to be able to serve the needs of K-12 educators. And they are tremendously hungry for this. I mentioned our MA program, which now attracts about 50 students a year in its third year. But more broadly, we do workshops all over the state. And that's been really important. That earned us the ability, the sort of trust of the State Board of Education, of legislators, in such a way that the state passed the new graduation requirement for high school seniors last year, asked us to help define its contours, what were the essentials of a citizen education, and then asked the State Board of Education in the legislation to coordinate with us in writing the standards. So that's put us in the position of being able to assemble the academic expertise, help develop the standards, and then we're also the principal provider of the professional development. So that adds up to a lot of impact in our classrooms, also takes a lot of attention away from the institution. That is one example of what being able to operate kind of independently allows you to do. I will point out one other advantage, one other difference. Because the center pre-existed, we already had some endowed positions. We already had a very healthy, sort of philanthropically funded set of programs. And since the creation of the Civic Thought and Leadership Initiative, we have still been able to maintain about half of our funding actually comes from philanthropic funding, and only about half of it comes from the state. That's allowed us to be quite flexible in terms of operating uh, outside of some of the vicissitudes of state funding and so forth. So I'd also urge people to think about what are ways that you can assemble some financial support that comes from multiple sources, and not just sort of single stream. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Daniel. Daniel maybe had to leave because I know he had to
No,
catch a flight.
I'm still with you for
great,
just
great.
a little bit more, so I can say a little, try to share a little bit more. I appreciate everyone bearing with me in my technical difficulties. I would just say, I think some quick notes to highlight. I think we've been very fortunate to have really terrific enrollment in our courses. I know some of the civic schools have struggled with this, but we've had a lot of enthusiasm from students. We've been able to, in some sense, piggyback on the very poorly designed general education curriculum at UNC, but that's actually turned out to be to our benefit. So we've been able to, each semester in the 4 semesters of existence, double the number of courses and the number of students that we're serving. So that's been, I think, a real positive thing. The second big positive thing that we've been able to do is stand up the beginnings of what we hope will eventually be a dormitory of students dedicated to civil discourse, dialogue across difference. So we have 40 students who sign up for a particular living situation, and we hope to eventually expand that so that we would have a whole dormitory with over 100 students. And that's also this year was its inauguration. There were 60 students. We've got 80 signed up for next year. Again, mimicking that higher touch liberal arts education that I mentioned previously. And then I think the third big highlight is a little bit along the lines of what Matt was just discussing, which is we do have some philanthropic dollars that let us do a lot of programming, and especially our, flagship speakers series has been exceptionally well attended over the last 2 years and really brought back genuine debate and civil discourse on campus on, tough and hard-hitting contemporary issues and also philosophic and historical issues. So I think that's been an area where we've been able to bring in a lot of people from across campus, from other units, from the public policy school, from political science, from history. So I think that's been a big bright spot. And I look at the events that we're lining up for next year, and that's been a really good way to build allies and make friends across campus. I'll leave it there, but happy to field more questions while
Great, thank you, Benjamin.
Yeah, I think Matt and Dan actually undersold one of their most extraordinary strengths, which is the
We
and
lost your
social
audio there,
sciences.
Ben.
Oh, sorry. Let's see. Can you hear me, guys?
Now we can.
Okay. I was just saying that there's astonishing job growth in schools of civic thought. And it's one of the only growth areas in the humanities and social sciences. So my wife and I wrote an article about this in the Chronicle of Higher Education a couple of years ago. And at the time, we tallied the creation of some 200 academic jobs, and that was in 2024. It's gone much further since then, and that is one of the reasons that these programs are getting positive attention from places in elite private higher education, because they have to pay attention to the question of where the jobs are. So it's the enrollment growth that Dan talked about. That's terrific news, and you can also see that at a place like the University of Texas, which has had spectacular enrollment growth since it started also. But it's not only growth at the student level; it's also growth at the faculty level. And that speaks to one of the negatives or downsides of all this, which is the negative press. And I just urge you all to, if you're interested in these programs and you want to know more about their development, talk to people like Matt and Dan, talk to other people who are involved in this around the country, talk to them directly, because the press coverage is really it's not fair, but it's also just not competent. And let me give you a concrete example of that. There was an unpleasant story about all this in the New York Times not that long ago. The story was so incompetent that they photographed the wrong building when they were attempting to show you the new School of Civic Life and Leadership. I happen to know very well a student who's involved in that program, who knows a lot of the other students who were quoted for that story. And she tells me that a lot of them felt like they were quoted out of context, and not really they were not really allowed to reflect on what has been, from what I hear, again directly, an extraordinarily positive experience among the students in that program, in the kind of education that they're getting there. And so, over time, I'm confident that excellence in the classroom, the excellence in research that scholars like Dan and Matt and their colleagues represent, that's going to leave its mark and gain the recognition that these programs deserve from the broader academic community.
Thank you. Okay, here's a little bit more of a conflictual or argumentative type of question. Okay, civics and citizen action. Hasn't this been going on since the 70s with the influence of the new left at universities? They're the ones that got more aggressive about doing this. And if that's true, and you all are competing with them now in a way that you've described successfully, then don't you have a big battle in store for you, because they're not going to take this lying down. They're going to attempt to stop you, capture, take over your institutions, and so on. Matthew?
Oh yeah, certainly. I do think the legislative mandate's very helpful here, for making clear who in the institution owns the initiatives. I would draw a little bit of a distinction. Dan has mentioned civil discourse, students talking across differences. That's a sort of, I guess you could think of it both as a kind of methodological intervention that is just getting people to talk, but also it's a fairly nonpartisan intervention in the sense of cultivating certain virtues regarding these things. And I think too the focus on citizenship and I know in Ben's borrowing from Peter Levine's idea of the citizen question, what should we do? Um, it sounds a bit like action civics in some respects, but in its actual implementation, we usually like to talk about on campus the crucial thing that we're trying to cultivate is not actually more students going to the polls, holding signs, working on political campaigns, the usual sort of measures of what people might call civic engagement. Um, we measure things at a much more basic level. To what degree are we cultivating civil society or students who are confident about participating in civil society? And we don't couch that in terms of political activism. So I would say there's a heavy Tocquevillian bent to the program that we run. We don't spend a lot of time encouraging students to go work in politics and do these sort of overtly political activities. Instead, we focus pretty heavily on civic knowledge, cultivating attachment to uh, a, 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 basically our political and intellectual tradition, especially our Constitution, and trying to find a civic common ground. Um, I usually talk about these things in terms of, you know, we're in desperate need of a common ground civically. And I don't see a much better one than our constitutional tradition. So, putting focus on the Constitution, we've made ourselves the sort of, more or less official academic partner of the America 250 Commission in the state, because we're able to just tackle it with gusto. We just hosted, to give you an idea of this, we just partnered with the University Wind Symphony to make their spring concert a symphony about the 250th anniversary. It was a sort of declaration themed musical concert with live actors doing vignettes from George Washington, Frederick Douglass, and Susan B. Anthony. Um, and it brought in a lot of people from the community. So when we talk about the sort of the citizen or the what should be done and these other things, I think when people see it in practice, they see a pretty stark difference between that and what the Center for Social Impact over in the neighboring building is doing, right? We're not pressing our students into the political process to go be activists in any sense of the term. And the students we attract, I think this is really where the rubber meets the road. If you go look at the students we attract into our Tocqueville Fellows program, which is a sort of academic community, we recruit about 20 students a year into, and our constitutional studies minors, into the 20 or so research assistants we employ on the Quill project, studying constitutional conventions. Um, they don't have a partisan valence. The students are, they're disproportionately interested in public life, but uh, they're not overwhelmingly conservative in comparison with the university, nor are they, political activists or progressives. And so I think in the sort of what the fruit of the thing is, the students that a focus on the intellectual tradition, a focus on, frankly, just important questions. I think, Dan pointed this out. Like, what if you ask people what important subjects are in the area of civics and politics and government? They're going to say things like, gosh, yeah, I'd like to study the world wars or the Civil War or, presidents, founders, great books. What are the great ideas? Constitutional law. These are the kinds of things that people are going to name instinctively as being important. And they're sort of the last things that the disciplines teach. So when you actually offer those things, rather than some menu of political activism or policy prescriptions or whatever else it is, some ideology. It attracts a lot of students, and it attracts a lot of students from all over the map politically. So I think the proof is in the pudding. And if you look at the students that we attract and what they're studying and what they're doing and how they behave, it's a much better picture than I think our sort of competitors on campus can present.
Thank you. Daniel?
Yeah, I just would add a couple of points. I apologize for the background noise. Um, you know, I think what, Ben, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and talk while Dan is see if we can get Dan again in a minute. Thanks for the question. I would in a way dispute the premise that is that once upon a time before the 1970s, we lived in a kind of pure, unclouded, settled world of dispassionate academic inquiry. Really urge you all to, if you're interested in this question, take a look at Julie Rubin's book, The Making of the Modern University, in which she goes through and just describes the extraordinary movement across universities and their structures of knowledge seeking from the 1870s through the 1930s. And we can see that process continuing ever since. And so in this sense, I think it's the notion that there was once pure scholarship that was later clouded by scholar activism. I think that dichotomizes things in a way that just really isn't helpful because it's just not true to how reality actually is. I think our active lives and our contemplative lives are actually touch one another on a lot of points. And when it comes to things like the structures of universities, if you think about what professors are doing when they're thinking about who to hire, when they're thinking about what courses to teach, those are questions that bear on action, just as much as they are questions that bear on theory. You're making decisions about how the university ought to go forward, and so I think we don't help our own case when we accept that dichotomization of pure thinking on the one hand and clouded action, or impure action on the other. The other thing that I would say is look for allies in strange places. You'd be surprised. And I've heard stories about this from many of my friends working on campuses around the country who have found allies among people that they wouldn't expect. Just recently, I've experienced this in my own right. I just finished teaching a course at Johns Hopkins with a post-colonialist scholar named Robbie Shilliam. Robbie and I don't agree about much. We are divided by background and training and political outlook and everything else. But he's really interested in tackling a lot of these questions with me. And I think that's true for a lot of people on a lot of campuses. I think there's a lot of people that recognize some of the excesses of the 2010s, the early 2020s, and are looking to help us rebuild an academy in which a much larger number of Americans feel like they have a sense of a stake and a sense of ownership. And so, in that sense, I'd be open to those kinds of unusual alliances.
Thanks, Ben, for picking up the torch. I would just add briefly, that obviously there were, civic related initiatives dealing with getting people into politics and campaigns, and that's all fine. What's interesting is a lot of that, with even much of the academic interest in civics, has just declined over the last few years. It's at UNC, for example, it's just not a presence. I mean, maybe there's a few people that are interested in teaching in prisons and stuff like that. But for example, there isn't even a legislative internship program, and the state legislature, the Capitol, is right down the road, 20 minutes away. So that would be the kind of thing we would be interested in helping to stand up to give students a little bit more touch with the practical world. So I guess I just don't see, at least at the institutions I've been involved with, that there's this strong force lingering from the 1970s of civics, of organizing people for campaigns and and so on. It's just not present at UNC for now, but I'll leave it there.
Hey, thank you. So we're nearing the end of our time. What I wanted to do just last was to ask each of you to make any other points that you think are important, either based upon what the others have said or something that has occurred to you since you finished your own presentations. So Matthew, can we start with you?
Yeah, I'd make one, which is do whatever can be done. So if it's easy to look at the sort of paradigms. And I would say, Chapel Hill is a bit of a paradigm case. The legislature really bought in, um, gave them a replete academic structure, the authority of a college to hire faculty, tenure them, establish programs. You could see other examples of that, things like Hamilton College, which in its scope and scale and its level of resources has been able to create what amounts to an Oxford College inside of a state flagship university, spanning the humane letters and civic inquiry. And you could deduce others. But I would say, if you're looking at what can you do at your own institution, I would make this appeal to, if you can't get outside intervention, and frankly, donors can go a long way too, sell them on this. Uh, but I found very effective making the appeal to the institution, to deans, provosts, especially, sometimes department chairs, often faculty and the faculty senate just don't listen to outside input very well. But I found people in leadership positions are sympathetic to the claim that, look, the institution has lost its credibility. Higher education's in the doldrums in terms of public credibility and public trust. And so maybe it's worth taking a look at what people in public would nod along to if you said, the university sees a civic problem and here's a solution to it. And the real question to ask yourself is, what would make the ordinary person in my state, my community, nod along and go, well, that seems like a sensible thing to do. And, urge them. There's nothing stopping the political science department, your institution, from rebranding as government and civic life, which is what we've sort of proposed. We said, okay, well, you want to build a sort of joint institution, put our faculties together to do these things. Well, we've got to put a label on it and sell a vision of it that meets the need, that satisfies this public desire for this sort of thing, that doesn't sound like an activist organization, but it sounds like it's recovering inquiry into things that the public and the community think are important and that will benefit our students and contribute something that's missing in the university. So you don't have to have a legislative mandate to do that, and find the partners that will work with you. If you just canvass the names of institutions, the center, the School of Civic Life and Leadership, School of Civic Leadership at Texas, the Institute for American Civics, the Center for Constitutional Studies, the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, the Institute for Governance and Civics at FSU, the School of Civic and Constitutional Thought and Leadership at one of the Ohio institutions. These span all sorts of levels of inquiry. So figure out what fits your institution, what meets the need, what partners you have in existence, and what folks get excited about in your legislature, your trustees, your donors, and run with it.
Thank you. Daniel?
I think Dan just said he needed to drop off.
Cool.
I'll just pop in a quick word. I entirely agree with what Matthew just had to say. The only thing I'd add to it is do what you can and it is appropriate for the place that you're in, and work with external academic partners. That is, it's been that is, make yourself a part of this larger network that people like Matt and Dan have helped to create. Learn from what others are doing and build something like a field of study that has the chance to survive over the academic long term.
Okay, well, thank you all so much. That's been wonderful and very inspiring too, based upon the impacts that people have been talking about and the response from the students, from the community. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank
Yes.
you to Shale for emceeing the event. Yes, thanks again, Matt Brogdon, Dan DeSalvo, Benjamin Story. I very much hope we can emulate what you are doing in Wisconsin. I hope that what you're doing can lead to possible alternative approaches to accrediting of degrees in other institutions, just making people reassess what it is that we used to value in not only in America and America's Constitution, but in a quality education. So thank you and more power to you all.
Thanks you all for having us. It's been great to talk to you this afternoon.
Yeah, it's a privilege to be part of it. Thank you.
All right, take care.